protagonist stands on the balcony of his luxurious penthouse and celebrates his latest victory, securing a $500 million deal that solidifies his status as the titular head of a tech empire. But as he enjoys the moment, his phone rings with an anonymous message. Enjoy it while it lasts. Tomorrow you'll lose everything. Drop out. He is shocked when he stands up in the morning, so subscribe to the channel before proceeding with the video. The next morning, the protagonist woke up to a nightmare he could never have imagined. His phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, each one more alarming than the last. The news was everywhere. His company, once the crown jewel of the tech industry, was in freefall. His empire, valued at $100 million just the day before, was unraveling faster than he could process. As he scrambled out of bed, he immediately turned on his laptop, only to find that he was locked out of his own systems. The company's servers had been breached in a sophisticated cyber attack. Sensitive data was leaked online, from confidential client agreements to blueprints of upcoming projects that were supposed to revolutionize the market. It wasn't just a technical issue. This was a full-blown catastrophe. Desperate, he called his chief technology officer, who confirmed the worst. The breach wasn't random. Someone with intimate knowledge of the company's infrastructure had orchestrated it. The layers of security they had in place weren't just bypassed, they were dismantled with precision. It was an inside job. The fallout was immediate and devastating. Shareholders panicked, dumping their stocks en masse. The company's value nosedived and the media vultures circled, speculating on the company's future and the scandal that had brought it to its knees. Clients started pulling out of contracts, their trust shattered. Employees flooded the protagonist's inbox with messages, their fears of layoffs and instability palpable. The office, once a bustling hub of innovation, was now a war zone of frayed nerves and hushed accusations. Fingers were pointed and tensions rose as the staff speculated about who could have betrayed them. Everyone was a suspect. The protagonist's mind raced as he tried to make sense of it all. Who would do this? And why? His thoughts kept circling back to the cryptic message from the night before. Enjoy it while it lasts. Tomorrow you'll lose it all, Dropout. Was it a coincidence, or had his anonymous sender been involved? The betrayal felt personal. He had built the company from the ground up, pouring his blood, sweat, and tears into its success. Now it was all slipping through his fingers, and the culprit was someone he had trusted. The weight of the betrayal crushed him as he realized the fight to save his empire had only just begun. As the chaos unfolded and his once stable empire crumbled around him, the protagonist's phone rang. For a moment, he hesitated. The caller ID displayed a name he hadn't seen in years. His brother's. A mix of emotions flooded his mind, confusion, anger, and a sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, his brother was calling to offer some sort of support in this moment of unimaginable crisis. He answered, his voice shaky from the morning's turmoil. Hello? On the other end, his brother's voice was sharp, cutting through the tension like a blade. Guess the dropout curse runs in the family after all, he said, his tone dripping with disdain. The protagonist froze, the words landing like a punch to the gut. There was no sympathy, no concern, just bitterness. His brother's remark wasn't just cruel, it was pointed, almost as if he had been waiting for this moment. What are you talking about? The protagonist demanded, trying to steady his voice. But his brother didn't answer directly. Instead, he laughed, a cold, mirthless sound that sent chills down the protagonist's spine. You always thought you were better than me, didn't you? Always so sure you were the genius, the one who'd make it big while I was left behind. How's that working out for you now? The words stung. They weren't entirely unfounded, and the protagonist knew it. Their relationship had always been complicated, marked by rivalry and unspoken grievances. Years ago, he had made the decision to leave his brother behind, focusing solely on building his empire. It hadn't been an easy choice, but it was one he felt necessary at the time. Now it seemed those wounds had festered into something darker. What do you want? The protagonist asked, his frustration rising. If you called to gloat, save it. I have enough to deal with. But his brother didn't back down. Instead, his voice grew colder. Oh, I just wanted to remind you of one thing. This was bound to happen. You've always been a fraud, And now everyone else is starting to see it too. Before the protagonist could respond, the line went dead, leaving him staring at the screen. The call wasn't just an insult, it was a puzzle. What did his brother know? And why did it feel like he had been waiting for this moment all along? Amidst the swirling chaos and the unraveling of his empire, the protagonist found himself on the edge of despair. Each lead he pursued seemed to hit a dead end, leaving him increasingly isolated in his fight to uncover the truth. That was when he received an email, anonymous, cryptic, and impossible to ignore. The subject line read, "You don't know the whole story." The message was brief but chilling. It claimed the sender was a former employee who had been forced out of the company under suspicious circumstances. Intrigued but cautious, the protagonist agreed to meet in a secluded cafe, his curiosity tempered by the possibility of walking into a trap. When the two met, the former employee was unrecognizable at first, a disheveled figure who looked far removed from the sharp, ambitious team he had once led. Their handshake was brief, and the tension between them was palpable. The employee wasted no time on pleasantries. "I know what's happening to you," they began, their voice low but steady, "and I know who's behind it." The protagonist leaned forward, his skepticism evident. "Why should I trust you? Last I heard, you were fired for misconduct." A bitter smile crossed the whistleblower's face. "That's what they told you. The truth? I was forced out because I started asking questions. Questions about irregularities in our financials, backdoor deals, and suspicious contracts that didn't add up. They didn't want me digging too deep." The former employee produced a folder, sliding it across the table. Inside were documents, emails, transaction logs, and even internal memos, all pointing to a covert operation to destabilize the company from within. The evidence was damning, but it also hinted at a larger conspiracy, one that seemed far too intricate to be the work of a single saboteur. "What's in this for you?" the protagonist asked, still wary. The whistleblower hesitated, their eyes narrowing as if weighing how much to reveal. "Let's just say I've got my own reasons for wanting to take them down. But don't think I'm doing this for you. You're not innocent in all this either." The word struck a nerve, but the protagonist couldn't afford to let pride get in the way. The lead was the most promising one he had, even if it came from a source whose motives were shrouded in shadows. As they parted ways, he knew this alliance could either save his empire or destroy it completely. The chaos surrounding the protagonist's crumbling empire pushed him to dig deeper into his past, searching for clues that might explain the betrayal. As he sifted through old files and memories he'd long buried, he stumbled upon a relic from another life, a dusty notebook tucked away in a forgotten box. The cover was faded, but the sight of it made his chest tighten. It was a relic of his college dropout days, a time when his ambition was boundless and his relationship with his brother was unbroken. Flipping through its pages, he saw the intricate diagrams and hastily scribbled notes that had once been the blueprint for a shared dream. Back then, he and his brother had worked side by side, their makeshift lab a cramped dorm room overflowing with wires, laptops, and energy drinks. They had spent countless nights developing an algorithm that they believed would change the world. An AI model so advanced it could predict human behavior with uncanny accuracy. They were inseparable then, united by a shared vision in the fire of youthful determination. His brother, the quieter of the two, had been the architect of the algorithm's mathematical core, while he had focused on refining its practical applications and pitching their vision to anyone who would listen. Together they were unstoppable, or so it had seemed. But ambition has a way of corroding even the strongest bonds. The first crack appeared when a venture capitalist expressed interest in funding their project. The investor made it clear he wanted a singular point of contact, someone who could sell the idea with charisma and confidence. The protagonist fit the bill perfectly. His brother, brilliant but introverted, was reluctant to step into the spotlight. What started as a minor disagreement spiraled into a full-blown rift. The protagonist believed the investor's offer was their golden ticket, but his brother wasn't convinced. He wanted to refine the algorithm further, to ensure it was perfect before releasing it to the world. Impatient and desperate to seize the opportunity, the protagonist made a decision that changed everything. He patented the algorithm under his name alone, His brother was devastated, seeing the move not just as a betrayal, but as a theft of their shared legacy. The partnership dissolved overnight. The protagonist justified his actions at the time, convincing himself it was for the greater good. And in a way, it worked. The algorithm became the foundation of the empire he built. But now, as the empire crumbled, he couldn't escape the irony. Holding the notebook in his hands, he felt the weight of his choices. He had buried this chapter of his life, but the cracks in his empire made it clear the past wasn't done with him. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. His brother wasn't just estranged, he had every reason to seek revenge. As the protagonist dug deeper into the unraveling mystery surrounding his company's collapse, a troubling pattern began to emerge. His empire's largest investor, a powerful and enigmatic figure named Victor Kane, was a man with a reputation for playing both sides to his advantage. Victor had been with the company since its early days, providing the crucial funding that turned a fledgling idea into a tech giant. But now, as the pieces of the puzzle came together, it seemed Victor's intentions had been far from altruistic. The first clue came from an offhand comment made by the whistleblower during one of their covert meetings. They mentioned a series of quiet conversations Victor had held with certain employees before their abrupt exits, including the whistleblower themselves. At first, the protagonist dismissed it as paranoia, but the more he investigated, the more connections he uncovered. Victor wasn't just an investor, he was a puppeteer. His financial backing had given him access to the company's inner workings, and he had used that position to weave a web of influence. The records revealed subtle but consistent patterns, suggestions that had quietly nudged key projects toward failure, strategic partnerships that benefited Victor more than the company, and even backdoor channels of communication with the board. But the most damning revelation came when the protagonist discovered Victor's ties to his brother. A trail of financial transactions, hidden beneath layers of shell companies, linked Victor to a small tech startup, one his brother had quietly co-founded years after their falling out. It was a startling discovery. Victor had been funding the startup, keeping it afloat while simultaneously undermining the protagonist's empire. The implications were staggering. Victor had positioned himself as a benefactor to both brothers, carefully stoking the fires of their old rivalry. The protagonist realized with growing horror that many of the tensions he thought were personal, his brother's cryptic call, the whistleblower's accusations, had been meticulously engineered by Victor to destabilize the company. Victor's ultimate goal became clear. By pitting the brothers against each other, he could create enough chaos to force a leadership vacuum. With the company in shambles, Victor could step in as the savior, seize control, and reap the rewards of the empire's rebuilding. The protagonist felt a surge of anger and disbelief. Victor had played him, exploiting his ambition and his fractured relationship with his brother. But more than that, he felt a deep sense of guilt. He had let Victor into his world, trusting him without question, and now everything he had built was on the brink of collapse. The realization was as sobering as it was infuriating. If he was to save what remained of his empire, and perhaps repair the broken bond with his brother, he would have to outmaneuver Victor Kane. But taking on a man who thrived in the shadows would be the most dangerous challenge of his life. The confrontation between the protagonist and his brother was inevitable, a storm that had been building for years, fueled by old wounds and recent betrayals. It took place in a dimly lit room, far from the public eye and the chaos surrounding the protagonist's empire. The air between them crackled with tension as they sat across from each other, the weight of their shared history pressing down on them. "Why?" the protagonist finally demanded, his voice thick with a mix of anger and hurt. "Why would you do this to me? To us?" His brother, who had always been the quieter and more introspective of the two, stared at him for a long moment before answering. "You don't get to act like the victim. Not after what you did," he said, his tone sharp and bitter. "What I did?" The protagonist leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I built this company, our company. I worked night and day to make it a success. And you left me behind to do it," his brother shot back, his voice rising for the first time. "Do you even remember those nights in college, when we were supposed to be partners? You took everything we built together and put your name on it, like I didn't even exist." The words hung in the air, cutting deeper than the protagonist had expected. He had always justified his actions back then as necessary sacrifices for success, but hearing them thrown back at him now, he couldn't deny the pain they had caused. "But this," the protagonist said, motioning to the chaos surrounding their lives. "Leaking confidential information? Sabotaging everything I've worked for? That's not revenge, it's destruction." His brother exhaled heavily, leaning back in his chair. "Do you think I wanted it to come to this? I was manipulated just like you. Victor Kane played us both, stoking the flames of everything we'd buried. He funded my startup, whispered in my ear about how you'd never cared about me, about how you'd do it all over again if it meant keeping your empire intact." The mention of Victor made the protagonist's blood run cold. "Victor used you," he said, the realization sinking in. "And I let him," his brother admitted, his voice cracking. "I let my resentment blind me. I thought if I could bring you down, maybe I'd finally get the recognition I deserved. But I didn't see what he was really doing until it was too late." The room fell silent, the weight of the confession settling over them. The protagonist felt a mixture of anger, sorrow, and regret. His brother had betrayed him, but the betrayal hadn't come from malice. It had come from years of pain, jealousy, and manipulation. "What now?" the protagonist asked finally, his voice softer. His brother looked at him with weary eyes. "Now? We stop him. Together." It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't a resolution, but it was a start. For the first time in years, the brothers found themselves on the same side, united against a common enemy, and the tangled web of betrayal that had nearly destroyed them both. The meeting with Victor Kane felt like stepping into a predator's den. The investor exuded a calm menace, his perfectly tailored suit and composed demeanor only amplifying the sinister undertone of his words. The protagonist had faced high-stakes negotiations before, but this was different. This was personal. Victor leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he fixed the protagonist with a calculated stare. "You've put up quite a fight," he began, his voice smooth but laced with threat. "But let's not drag this out any longer. I'm here to offer you a way out." The protagonist remained silent, his jaw tight, waiting for Victor to show his hand. "I'll make it simple," Victor continued, his tone almost conversational. "Relinquish control of the company to me. Sign over your shares, step down as CEO, and walk away quietly. If you do, I'll ensure your brother walks away too." The words hung in the air like a thundercloud. "My brother?" the protagonist asked, his voice low and controlled. Victor's smirk deepened. "Oh yes, your brother. You see, he's in quite the precarious position. I've made sure of that." Victor slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents, bank statements, falsified contracts, and correspondence that painted a damning picture. According to these papers, the protagonist's brother was implicated in a series of financial crimes that could easily land him in prison for the rest of his life. "Of course, all of this is fabricated," Victor said casually, as if discussing the weather, "but the authorities won't know that. I've ensured the evidence is airtight. If this goes public, your brother won't just lose his freedom. He'll lose everything: his name, his reputation, his future." The protagonist's hands clenched into fists as he fought to keep his anger in check. "You would ruin a man's life just to take control of my company?" Victor's eyes narrowed, his predatory smile unwavering. "Ruin? No, I'm offering you a choice. I don't want to destroy your brother. I want your cooperation. Save him, and in return, you step aside. Everyone wins. Well, except for you, of course." The ultimatum was as cruel as it was calculated. Victor wasn't just targeting the company, he was exploiting the most vulnerable part of the protagonist's life, his family. It wasn't about business anymore. This was a game of power, and Victor held all the cards. For a moment, the protagonist felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. If he agreed, he would lose everything he had built, but he would save his brother. If he refused, his brother would face a fate worse than ruin. Victor leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You have 48 hours to decide. Think carefully. Sacrifices are inevitable in a game like this. The question is, how much are you willing to lose? As Victor stood to leave, the protagonist remained seated, his mind racing. The clock was ticking, and the stakes had never been higher. The fight wasn't just about saving his empire anymore. It was about saving his brother, even if it meant risking everything. The final confrontation felt like the closing act of a grand tragedy, each player stepping into a carefully choreographed sequence. The protagonist and his brother, united for the first time in years, had crafted a daring plan to expose Victor Kane. They had gathered every shred of evidence they could find: financial records, manipulated contracts, and even testimonies from those Victor had wronged. It was risky, reckless even, but they had no choice. The setting for the showdown was a high-profile industry gala, an event where Victor was set to announce his supposed acquisition of the company. The brothers knew they had to act before he solidified his control. As they moved through the glittering crowd, their nerves were taut, their movements synchronized like soldiers preparing for battle. The plan hinged on a public reveal. The protagonist would take the stage under the pretense of delivering a speech and instead lay bare Victor's web of deceit. Meanwhile, his brother worked behind the scenes, ensuring the evidence would be leaked to the press and key regulators in real time. Everything seemed to be falling into place. But as the protagonist began his speech, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind, he noticed something unusual. Victor wasn't reacting with the panic or anger he had expected. Instead, the man sat calmly at his table, a faint smile playing on his lips. The realization came too late. Victor had been prepared for this. The doors to the gala burst open, and a familiar figure stepped into the room. It was the whistleblower, the very person who had set the brothers on their path to uncovering the truth. Their entrance drew murmurs from the crowd, but what followed left the room in stunned silence. The whistleblower didn't approach the stage to support the brothers. Instead, they walked directly to Victor's side, placing a hand on his shoulder. The smile on Victor's face grew wider as he stood, addressing the crowd with an air of triumph. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victor began, his voice dripping with mockery, "what you're witnessing tonight is nothing short of desperation. These two men, who built their empire on lies and betrayal, now seek to deflect blame for their own failures." The whistleblower's betrayal hit the brothers like a gut punch. They had trusted this person, seen them as an ally in their fight against Victor. But now it was clear they had been playing a deeper game all along. The whistleblower had been Victor's partner from the start, feeding the brothers just enough information to lead them into a trap. As Victor continued his speech, the brothers exchanged a glance. There was no time for words, only understanding. They weren't just fighting to expose the truth anymore. They were fighting to survive. In a desperate move, the protagonist grabbed the microphone, cutting Victor off mid-sentence. "This man," he said, pointing at Victor, "has manipulated and betrayed everyone in this room. And he's not working alone." He turned to the whistleblower. "Tell them the truth. Tell them what you've done." For a brief moment, the whistleblower faltered, their composure cracking under the weight of the room's gaze. But Victor's grip on their shoulders steadied them, and they said nothing. Chaos erupted as security moved to escort the brothers out. The evidence they had planned to reveal was intercepted, and the press was fed a carefully curated narrative that painted the brothers as villains. When the dust settled, the brothers found themselves outside the glittering venue, their empire reduced to ashes. They had lost everything: money, power, and the trust of those who had once believed in them. But as they stood together in the cold night, something unexpected emerged, a sense of solidarity. For the first time in years, they weren't adversaries. They had fought together, and though they had failed, they knew they could rebuild. "This isn't the end," the protagonist said, his voice resolute. His brother nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "Number, it's just the beginning. This time we do it right. Together." As they walked away from the ruins of their former lives, they carried with them a shared determination. The empire might have fallen, but the bond they had rediscovered was stronger than ever. And with that, they set out to forge a new path, one built on trust, redemption, and the promise of a better future.